The deafening roar of artillery is a constant on the Eastern Front. But on this frozen afternoon, beneath the steel-gray sky of a Russian winter, a new, more desperate sound echoes across the muddy battlefield. The grinding halt of machinery, the squeal of seized engines, the frantic curses of tank crews. An entire Soviet tank battalion, the spearhead of a critical counterattack, is dying not to German guns, but to its own failed transmissions. Their T-34s, the feared workhorses of the Red Army, are now nothing more than stationary metal coffins. They are scattered and vulnerable in the open field. German panzers are closing in. Destruction seems inevitable. But salvation would come not from high command, nor from a shipment of new parts. It would come from the mind of one man, a junior military engineer, and his radical, desperate idea. An idea born from a simple piece of trash. This is the story of how one engineer's trash can saved an entire tank battalion. The winter of 1943 was a season of unrelenting pressure and fleeting opportunity. Following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, the Red Army was pushing west. They were fueled by a surge of momentum and grim determination. They sought to capitalize on the shattered German lines. Their goal was to prevent the Wehrmacht from establishing a stable defensive position. Yet, the German army, though bloodied and reeling, remained a lethal and resilient foe. They were masters of tactical defense and brutal counterblows. In this grinding war of attrition, vast expanses of territory changed hands in fits and starts. The mechanized fist of the Soviet advance was the tank battalion. These mobile units were the breakthrough force. They were tasked with puncturing enemy lines, disrupting rear areas, and creating chaos. Their success or failure could decide the fate of an entire Army Corps offensive. One such unit was poised on the knife's edge of history in late January 1943. This was the 2nd Battalion of the 45th Guards Tank Brigade. It was part of the larger 3rd Guards Tank Army. Their mission was to break through stubborn German defensive lines near the battered city of Orel. The battalion was equipped with the iconic T-34/76. This was a tank rightfully revered for its revolutionary sloped armor. It had a potent 76.2 mm gun and superior mobility. It was a machine that had shocked the Germans in 1941. Now, it formed the backbone of the Soviet armored forces. But every weapon has its flaw. The T-34 had a known, critical Achilles heel. This was its fragile, overstressed final drive and transmission. These complex components were manufactured under immense strain. They were made in hastily relocated factories deep in the Urals. Their quality control was often sacrificed for sheer quantity. They were notoriously unreliable. The alloy steels were not always to specification. The machining could be rushed. Under the brutal, unforgiving demands of combat maneuvering, these units frequently failed. This included sudden stops and sharp pivots on frozen ground. It meant the constant strain of climbing out of muddy ravines. When a T-34's transmission died, the mighty medium tank became a 40-ton paperweight. Commanding the battalion's fragile logistical lifeline was junior military technician Ivan Petrovich Kucherenko. He was a 28-year-old engineer from the industrial city of Kharkiv. Kucherenko was not a frontline soldier in the traditional sense. He did not charge with a rifle or fire the main gun. His battlefield was the muddy, oil-stained repair park behind the lines. This was a chaotic landscape of broken tracks and blown engines. It was a place of hulls scarred by enemy fire. His weapons were wrenches, sledgehammers, and welding torches. He was a problem solver. He was a man who spoke the language of pistons and gears. He knew every bolt, every seam, every weakness of the T-34 intimately. He knew its fatal transmission flaw better than anyone. It was a personal, professional torment. The men of the battalion relied on Kucherenko and his small team. This included the hardened commander, Captain Vasily Sokolov. It also included the youngest, wide-eyed driver mechanic. They relied on his perpetually exhausted team of fitters and welders to perform miracles. They were the men who turned the damaged and broken back into the functional and deadly. The strategic situation in their sector was precarious. It was a delicate balance of force and timing. Intelligence suggested the German line was thin at a specific point. It was a seam between two fatigued infantry divisions. The battalion had orders to exploit a narrow breach. This breach would be created by a preliminary artillery barrage at dawn. Success could unhinge the local German regiment. It could force a panicked retreat. It could open a vital corridor for following infantry and heavy guns. Failure would mean a costly, bloody repulse. It would mean the waste of precious armored vehicles. It would be a lost opportunity that higher command might not afford again for weeks. The entire operation was planned in the dim light of a command dugout. It hinged on one simple, mechanical fact. The battalion's tanks had to be operational. They had to move, shoot, and survive. As the crews performed their final checks, a thick blanket of night covered them. The air was biting cold enough to freeze diesel. A silent, shared dread accompanied the freezing fog that rolled across the assembly area. The transmission failures were not a matter of if, but when and how many. Every driver felt it. It was a whispered anxiety every time they shifted gear. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with a metallic clatter. It brought the thunderous, coughing advance of diesel engines. The battalion was 23 T-34 strong. It rolled forward in a staggered line across the frozen, crusted ground. A few brave knots of infantry clung to their hulls for a desperate ride into hell. The world dissolved into a cacophony of noise. There was the roar of engines. There was the crunch of ice and dirt under steel tracks. There was the distant crump of outgoing Soviet artillery. For the first hour, the attack gained shocking momentum. The initial German outposts were manned by weary, frozen grenadiers. They were crushed under the tracks or fled before the advancing steel tide. The T-34's guns barked. They destroyed a hastily positioned 37mm anti-tank gun and several machine gun nests. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions in battle, began to flicker. It flickered in the hearts of the Soviet tankers. But as the drivers pushed their machines harder, trouble emerged. They urged them across treacherous, shell-pocked terrain. They navigated around the skeletal remains of earlier battles. They executed sharp, sliding turns to engage suspected enemy positions. A tank on the left flank, call sign Sibir, shuddered violently to a stop. It was as if it had hit an invisible wall. Thick, black smoke began to pour from its engine deck. The driver's hatch flew open. The man emerged coughing, his face a mask of frustration and fear. Then another tank, Malat, simply ground to a halt. Its engine was racing, but its tracks were stationary. Then two more failed, almost simultaneously. The dreaded, static-filled signal crackled over the battalion radio net. Waiting to be discovered? Mechvod reporting, transmission failure. We are immobile. Repeat, immobile. The words were a death knell. By 1,000 hours, the weak winter sun attempted to breach the gloom. 7 tanks were dead in the water. They were sitting ducks for lurking German anti-tank guns. These guns were now undoubtedly tracking their progress. The Soviet advance stalled. Its momentum bled out into the frozen mud. German artillery observers now clearly pinpointed the stationary behemoths. They began to walk a line of heavy shells across the field. Geysers of dirt and snow erupted around the immobilized T-34s. The once orderly attack was dissolving into chaos. Junior technician Kucherenko followed behind the assault wave. He was in a battered, open-topped BA-64 armored car fitted as a recovery vehicle. He felt a cold, solid knot of panic tighten in his stomach. This was not the usual 1 or 2 breakdowns. This was systemic, catastrophic collapse. He raced from one immobilized tank to the next. He leapt from his vehicle under sporadic mortar fire. His diagnostic tools confirmed the same grim verdict each time. He used a mechanic's ear and a practiced eye. The verdict was shattered planetary gears in the final drive assembly. The delicate, precision-engineered teeth were sheared clean off. They left only jagged metal stumps. The tanks needed complete transmission replacements. But the brigade's spare parts depot was a nightmarish 20 kilometers to the rear. It was along a single, muddy track. This track was under constant German harassing shellfire. It was likely observed by forward scouts. Even if by some miracle he could get a truck loaded with transmission units through that gauntlet, replacing a T-34 transmission in the field was a 6-hour job. This was for a skilled crew under ideal, quiet conditions. These were not ideal conditions. This was an active killing ground. The volume of incoming fire was increasing by the minute. By 11:30 hours, the count had risen to 11 tanks immobilized. This was nearly half the battalion's strength. German mortar and machine gun fire was now probing their positions with increasing intensity. Captain Sokolov looked through his scratched binoculars from his command tank. He could see the distinctive, low-slung shapes of German Panzer IVs. They had long 75mm guns. He also saw the even lower silhouettes of Stu G3 assault guns. They were moving with deliberate slowness into hull-down positions. They were on a distant, dark tree line, just over a kilometer away. They were not rushing. They were methodically preparing for the kill. They were choosing their firing lanes and conserving ammunition. The battalion was being methodically dissected. It was like a surgeon isolating a diseased organ. Every minute that passed brought the German armor closer to optimal range. Their high-velocity 75mm KWK 40 guns were more than capable. They could punch through a T-34's frontal armor at this distance. The fear that now gripped the men was a specific, chilling variety. It was not the fear of a quick, violent death in a fiery charge. It was the slow, cold terror of helpless execution. They were entombed in 35 tons of steel. They were waiting for the shot that would turn their world into fire. They were trapped, and they knew it. The crisis, by 1400 hours, was absolute and inescapable. 15 of the battalion's 23 tanks were immobilized. They were scattered across a square kilometer of open, exposed field. They were like wounded animals awaiting the predator. The remaining 8 functional tanks had formed a ragged, desperate defensive perimeter. They fired their main guns and machine guns at the distant tree line. This was to suppress the growing German threat. But they were hopelessly outnumbered and tactically out of position. German machine gun fire began to ping and whine off the hulls of the stranded T-34s. It came from MG-34s and 42s. This was a constant, terrifying reminder of their vulnerability. It kept the crews pinned inside. They were sweating in the cold, listening to the deadly metallic rain. Then, a direct artillery hit struck one immobilized tank. Its call sign was Jürgen. It sent a terrifying plume of orange fire and thick, oily black smoke boiling into the gray sky. The ammunition inside cooked off in a secondary explosion. It tore the turret from the hull. The sight was a grim, unambiguous portent. It showed what awaited them all. Inside his command tank, Captain Sokolov's voice was tight with controlled strain. He spoke into the radio handset to brigade headquarters. Tiger Base, this is Battalion 2 Actual. We are immobilized. I say again, immobilized. Over half our strength is down. Enemy armor is assembling in strength on the western tree line. Request immediate artillery fire on grid sector 79er and permission to abandon and destroy vehicles. The wait for a reply felt like an age. The only sound was the crackle of static and the distant crump of shells. The reply, when it came, was a hammer blow to the soul. Battalion 2 Actual, Tiger Base. Request denied. You must hold your position at all costs. A counterattack by the 112th Rifle Division is being organized. Reinforcements are estimated at 8 hours. You must hold. 8 hours. It was an eternity. They would be overrun, destroyed, and erased in two. In the relative, fragile safety of his recovery truck, Kucherenko stared, unseeing. He looked at a disassembled final drive unit he had dragged from one of the tanks. The delicate, shredded gears spilled into the mud at his feet. They were like the innards of a dead beast. The factory-perfect replacements were an impossible dream, a fantasy. They needed a miracle. Or they needed to make one. His mind was racing faster than the German shells now falling around him. It darted from the broken gears to the empty spare parts bins on his truck. It went to the churned, frozen mud of the field. It settled on the smoking, tragic hull of Tank Jürgen. And then, as if guided by some desperate instinct, his eyes settled on a common object. It was an utterly mundane object lying discarded and forgotten. It was near the smoldering remains of a field kitchen. It was a standard issue, galvanized steel trash can. It was battered and soot-stained. What happened next in that frozen field would become the stuff of legend. It was a tale passed among repair crews and tankers long after the guns fell silent. Kucherenko's mind was rigorously trained in orthodox engineering principles. Yet now it was forged and tempered in the crucible of frontline necessity. It made a leap of pure, desperate ingenuity. He analyzed the problem not as a textbook failure, but as a battlefield imperative. The problem was the planetary gear assembly. This was a complex, precision-machined unit. It allowed the differential action. It distributed power from the transmission to the drive sprockets. This let one track turn faster than the other, enabling the tank to steer. When it failed, the power had nowhere to go. The tank could not move. The solution, Kucherenko realized with stunning clarity, wasn't to repair the irreparable gears. It was to bypass them entirely, to make them irrelevant. He called his exhausted, grease-stained mechanics together. Their faces were pale with fear and fatigue. "Forget the gears," he shouted. His voice rose over the whine of incoming shells and the chatter of machine guns. "We don't repair them. We lock the differential. We weld the final drive housing solid from the inside. The tank will only drive straight, you understand? No turning, no steering, but it will drive. It will move forward." The key to this insane plan was his trash can fix. Grabbing the can, he and a sergeant used an axe and welding torch. They cut the bottom out, fashioning a crude, cylindrical mold. They placed this makeshift sleeve around the damaged final drive housing. It was on the nearest immobilized T-34. His team worked with frantic speed and gathered scrap metal. They took aluminum from damaged engine blocks. They took zinc from shell casing alloys. They used any non-ferrous metal that would melt at a lower temperature. Using their welding torches as improvised foundry furnaces and steel buckets, they created a bubbling, molten mixture. This they poured into the mold around the shattered gears inside the housing. It was brutal, crude, and utterly heretical. It defied every engineering manual ever written. This makeshift casting was performed under fire. It used tools meant for cutting and joining, not founding. It effectively fused the differential gears and the housing into a single, solid, immutable block of metal. The planetary gears, whether broken or whole, were now entombed. They were in a metallic tomb. Power from the transmission would now be transmitted equally and relentlessly. It would go to both tracks. The tank would be forced to move in a perfectly straight line. It would be a bullet, not a bird. The first test, the moment of truth, was on Tank 314. It was commanded by the veteran Sergeant Mikhailov. The crew watched with a mixture of skeptical terror and wild hope. Kucherenko's team worked in a frenzy under sporadic sniper and mortar fire. The acrid smell of molten metal and burning grease cut through the cordite-tainted air. In just 45 minutes, the trash can cast had cooled and set. This was a blink of an eye in mechanical terms. The driver mechanic was a young man from Siberia named Anatoly. He crossed himself quickly. It was a gesture from a childhood not yet fully erased by war. With a prayer on his lips, he engaged the clutch. The T-34's V12 diesel engine roared to life. The sound was suddenly full of promise instead of despair. He shifted into first gear. The tracks, with a violent, shuddering jerk, bit into the frozen mud. For a second, nothing. Then, with a lurch that shook the entire hull, Tank 314 began to move. It threw the crew against their stations. It did not move with a graceful turn, but forward. It went in a rigid, unwavering, terrifyingly straight line. It was a mechanical zombie, brought back to a singular, purposeful life. A raw, rag cheer erupted from the crews of the other surrounded tanks. It was a sound of pure, undiluted relief and sudden, savage hope. It was not a tank anymore in any tactical sense. It was a battering ram, a blind, unstoppable force. But it was a mobile battering ram. Kucherenko's team split up. They replicated the process with manic energy. Using more trash cans, buckets, even sheet metal hastily hammered into troughs, they began casting the immobilized tanks back to a form of life. One by one, the dead giants awoke. They awoke with a jarring, mechanical scream of protesting metal. They could not maneuver. They could not turn. They could not perform the delicate dance of armored combat. But they could advance. And in that moment, advance was all that mattered. Captain Sokolov saw this bizarre resurrection. He seized the moment with the decisiveness of a commander given a last, desperate card to play. He issued new, brutally simple orders over the radio. His voice was now charged with a fierce energy. All repaired tanks, all units that can move, form a line. Link up with functional tanks on my mark. Your orders are simple. Advance directly on the German tree line. Maximum speed. Do not stop for anything. Do not attempt to turn. You are a wall of steel. Overrun them. Crush them. What then emerged from the smoke and chaos bewildered the waiting Germans. It then deeply unnerved the German panzer crews and grenadiers. A ragged but determined line of T-34s, perhaps 14 strong now, began to advance. They moved with a strange, robotic, terrifying determination. Their tracks churned the earth. Their engines screamed at full throttle. They did not zigzag. They did not seek cover behind folds in the ground. They did not pause to aim carefully. They simply came on. They were a relentless, straight-line avalanche of steel and hate. Their guns blazed wildly to the front. German anti-tank gunfire scored hits. It came from the dreaded 75mm Pak-40s. A repaired tank on the right flank took a direct hit to the transmission housing. Its makeshift cast shattered. It ground to a final, permanent halt. Another was disabled by a track hit. But the sheer, terrifying, illogical momentum of the charge was overwhelming. The T-34s were locked in their straight-line courses. They drove with horrifying inevitability straight through German forward machine gun nests. The German crews frantically scrambled out of their foxholes. They crushed a 37mm anti-tank gun under their tracks. The weapon's crew disappeared beneath 35 tons of unstoppable metal. They presented a target that was unnervingly predictable in its path. Yet, it was psychologically unstoppable in its intent. The German armor expected a faltering, disjointed enemy. They expected to pick them apart from a distance. They were caught completely off guard by this bizarre, almost suicidal head-on assault. Their tactical advantage was based on hitting stationary or maneuvering targets. They fired from prepared positions. This advantage evaporated in the face of this blunt, simple force. In the confusion and dust, the 8 still fully functional T-34s of the battalion exploited gaps. These gaps were created by the German distraction. They flanked the disoriented Panzer IVs. They engaged them from the side. The German position was based on cool, methodical killing. It collapsed into disorder. By dusk, the winter light bled from the sky. The surviving German vehicles were withdrawing. They left behind burning hulks and abandoned guns. The corridor, paid for in steel and blood, was secured. Against impossible odds, the battalion had held. The cost, as it always was on the Eastern Front, had been devastatingly high. Of the 23 tanks that began the dawn attack, 4 were complete, burning losses. They were lost from enemy fire. 11 bore the crude, welded-on trash can casts on their final drives. These were strange metallic scars testifying to their rebirth. The remaining 8 were battle-worn but functional. Crew casualties were significant. Men were killed by direct hits. Others were wounded by shrapnel and small arms fire while trapped in their immobilized tanks. Some were cut down during the frantic repair work. Yet the numbers were far lower than the total annihilation that had seemed certain. It had seemed certain only hours before. The battalion had not only survived a seemingly hopeless tactical situation, it had, against all logic, technically achieved its objective. It created the breach that following infantry would exploit. All thanks to the engineering desperation of one man. It was thanks to his blinding spark of ingenuity. For his extraordinary initiative, presence of mind, and decisive action under direct enemy fire, junior military technician Ivan Petrovich Kucherenko was later formally awarded the Order of the Red Star. This was a decoration for combat bravery. It recognized his unique contribution. His field modification, the trash can fix, was never adopted as standard procedure. It was a brutal last resort. It placed immense, unsustainable strain on engines, clutches, and the remaining transmission components. It often destroyed them completely after a few dozen kilometers of forced, straight-line travel. It was a trick that could only work once per tank. But in that one critical, defining moment, it transformed certain defeat and massacre. It created a shocking, desperate, and legendary victory. The legacy of Kucherenko's fix lies not in technical manuals or factory specifications. It lies in the very essence of wartime innovation. It is the triumph of adaptable, desperate human intellect. It triumphed over catastrophic material shortage and mechanical failure. It symbolized the relentless, often brutally pragmatic spirit. This spirit kept the Red Army moving westward. It was a spirit of finding solutions in the rubble. It meant scavenging salvation from the scrap heap. It turned simple trash into a tool of deliverance. The Eastern Front was a war of giants. It was a war of sweeping operational maneuvers and staggering numbers. These numbers numb the mind. Divisions, armies, millions of men. Yet, so often, the hinge of history turned on the actions of a single individual. They were in the exact right place, at the most desperate hour. In a field of mud and death, Ivan Kucherenko saw not a trash can, but a mold. He saw not scrap metal, but a solution. He saw not broken gears, but a problem to be circumvented by sheer will. His story forces us to ask a profound question. In the face of utter mechanical failure, with destruction looming and time evaporating, where would you find the tools to prevail? Could you see a path to salvation where everyone else saw only refuse and ruin? This was the razor's edge between survival and annihilation. It was walked by a mechanic with a welder's torch. If you are fascinated by these moments of incredible ingenuity, then you must hear more. These are moments where the fate of hundreds hinged on one person's desperate spark of brilliance. It happened in the crucible of combat. The war was filled with them. Make sure you subscribe to World War II Records Maker and hit the notification bell. We are dedicated to unearthing the forgotten turning points. We find the unsung decisions and the quiet moments of courage. We seek the sheer, unbreakable